Hello everyone. If you're watching this video, it means that I couldn't be here live, unfortunately, so I had to pre-record my presentation. Today I'm going to be talking about Google Translate and how this technology impacts our relationship with the environment. I will be focusing on mistranslations, so instances where the machine either misinterprets text or mistakes something for text, some random shape, something that is not textual. And by bringing machine translation in contact with environmental and sustainability discourse, I hope to demonstrate how mistranslations can help us work around some of the ideological constraints of capitalism. So here you see me using the camera option of Google Translate to translate an asemic piece by the Belgian painter and poet Christian d'Autremont. In Asemic, the Art of Writing, Peter Schwenger defines asemic writing as, quote, writing that does not attempt to communicate any message other than its nature as writing. But because this type of art looks like writing, then Translate mistakes this piece for text and therefore outputs unpredictable translations. When asemic art is turned into alphabetic writing, what was supposed to be a simple act of translation between languages from sign to a new signifier becomes instead a moment of algorithmic association, some kind of Rorschach test for algorithms. So the question is how can we read these mistranslations? On the one hand, the machine's bias is causing it to turn the world into a target, thereby reducing the complexity of the surroundings to what's already known to the machine, namely alphabetic text. On the other, the fact that the machine is associating non-alphabetic shapes with some unpredictable text could be considered as a sign of creativity on the part of the machine. When we look at the literature that has researched the way algorithms determine our thoughts and actions in our society, most of it underlines the dangers of algorithmic governance, the control that algorithms assert in determining an increasingly standardized future. Here I'm thinking of Mackenzie, Hallinan, and Strifas. I'm going to show the references at the end. In the context of machine translation, Ramati and Pinchevsky have argued that Google Translate impedes the possibility of spontaneous linguistic tropes because it is itself based on statistical calculation, and therefore can only indicate the most common and probable forms of written expression and by extension of interpretation. While it is not my intention to undermine the dangers of the algorithmic culture in which we live, nor to disregard the difference between communication and manipulation, I do, however, want to point out that the preoccupation with hidden motives, the mistrust that characterizes this type of thought, can be understood as signs of a paranoid mode of critique. Much has been said about paranoia and suspicion in critical theory by authors like Ricoeur, Felsky, and Sedgwick. In general terms, paranoia causes the subject's attention to be drawn towards associative connections that are then perceived as potential threats, leading the subject to a generalized mistrust and a hypervigilant and defensive reading of their surroundings. And I would like to add to that as a mode of critique, paranoia is oppositional, insofar as it causes the subject to separate from the formulated problem as if they were not themselves a part of the system of order that is being critiqued. In this sense, paranoia is based on the decontextualization of the subject from its surroundings or from its environment. In contrast, the kind of critique that I propose acknowledges that we are already a constitutive part of the problem that we are trying to formulate. So I propose to think of critique as a practice of worldly intervention that, rather than formulating problems from some external or privileged vantage point, is capable of recognizing its own participation in the formulated problem while simultaneously affirming its purpose to think and behave otherwise. So the argument that I'm putting forward today is that mistranslations can help us temporarily interrupt the control action that these algorithms otherwise produce, and thereby assist us in reimagining our relationship and positionality within the post-human environment. I'll get to do this by combining critical gestures with creative acts, where I recognize as an analyst my own participation in the formulated problem, while I also continue to entangle as a user in the technology that I analyze. Walter Benjamin writes that the task of the translator is, quote, to release in his own language that pure language which is exiled among alien tongues, unquote. Pure language is an ideal concept which denotes the totality of all language intentions supplementing one another. And every language would be then an imperfect part of this pure language. For Benjamin, translation is capable of transforming the character of the text and thereby also affect the limits of a language by making it pass through what he calls a continuum of transformations. Thus posed, translation is a creative and transformative practice since it causes language to continue to develop in unpredictable ways. Different is what he calls overnaming, a use of language that derives from judgment and which assigns name to things as if it had some kind of divine power to do so. Overnaming is dominated by abstraction rather than by transformation, and it thus reduces the singularity of other languages and of nature itself to its own terms. Through the concept of pure language, Benjamin intends to speak about that which cannot be communicated in language without overnaming it. So in the context of automated translation, then I ask, can the machine ever be a translator in Benjamin's sense of the term? In 2016, Google started to implement the use of deep neural networks in machine translation. Among other things, neural machine translation enables Translate to compute entire sentences as input, so without having to break them up in small phrases or single words, thereby greatly improving the accuracy and quality of automated translation. We could even speculate that by taking entire sentences as input, the machine starts to understand somehow what we mean by context, because it will translate accordingly, taking many more variables into account. These networks draw on a corpus of existing human-made translations. So it's basically trained by consuming already human-made translations, and it creates a translation model that can calculate the most probable translation of a text in a target language. Artificial neural networks enable Translate to virtually connect all 109 languages that it supports, allowing the network to translate even between language pairs which has never directly trained on, so bypassing many other languages that may connect that pair. This is what Johnson and Schuster calls zero-shot translation. And this has brought researchers to speculate about the existence of a statistical interlingua, which Ramati and Pinchevsky define as a language that, quote, both draws from all the languages that Translate processes, but at the same time transcends that linguistic multiplicity, end quote. Translate's statistical interlanguage is thus a quasi-language made up of numbers in a vector space that connects all the languages processed by the network while itself remaining incomprehensible to human understanding. Rather than reducing and overnaming Translate's interlingua as a mere abstract or conceptual space, I propose that we think of it as an ecology. If what is gestured in every translation is this ecology that cannot be represented without being reduced or overnamed, then I will propose now a way to start sort of turning this ecology into something sensible, something that we can see, something visual. Since I acknowledge that I'm, as an analyst, part of this ecology that I'm trying to conceptualize, it is no longer for me enough to simply formulate a problem. So what I'm trying to do now, what I'm going to show you, is a way of starting to interact with this ecology, to sort of, metaphorically get my hands dirty in it. I'll do this by taking one of Benjamin's sentences and translating it and then retranslating it over and over, paying attention to sort of the transformations of this sentence until the process eventually falls into repetition. So here there is a sentence from Benjamin's The Task of the Translator. Translation finds itself not in the center of the language forest, but on the outside facing the wooded ridge. It calls into it without entering, aiming at that single spot where the echo is able to give in its own language the reverberation of the work in the alien one. If we translate this sentence into Burmese and then into Japanese and back into English, it reads, "The translation is not in the middle of the language forest, but outside the forest. The echo is the only place in the language that can reflect the work of a foreign work. Enter without logging in." I repeat the process a few times, always reading what happens to the sentence. The translation is outside the forest, not in the middle of the forest. The sound of a single language can reflect the work of foreign workers. Log in without logging in. The translation is neither in the middle of the forest nor in the middle of the forest. The sound of language can reflect the work of foreign workers. Sign in without logging in. The translation is not in the middle of the forest, not in the middle of the forest. The tone of the words may reflect the work of foreign workers. Sign in without logging in. After this, the process falls very much into repetition. The translation is not in the middle of the forest, not found in the middle of the forest. The tone of the voice of words may reflect the work of foreign workers. Sign in without logging in. The translation is not in the middle of the forest, not found in the middle of the forest. The tone of the voice of words may reflect the work of foreign workers. Sign in without logging in. Using the network to retranslate the same sentence over and over again is a way of voicing the functioning and performance of the multiple layers of the network as they interact with Benjamin's sentence. After a few rounds of translation, this process falls into repetition. All the unfamiliar elements of the sentence have now been replaced by the network's linguistic predictions. The circularity of this process marks the limits of the network's codified environment and sort of capacities for linguistic transformation. If the purity of expression is, as Benjamin's right, communicable without residue, then this process can be read as representing precisely a movement towards those residues. In such case, rather than experiencing the purity of the network, what we are witnessing is the reduction of that purity. We approach instead the machine's preempted known. Interestingly, it is as if both Benjamin's ideal language and Translate's linguistic reduction had a similar effect. The purity of language is precisely that which cannot be predicted in the continuum of transformations. And yet, the reduction of Benjamin's sentence, by way of redundancy, manages to somehow make legible the limits of this ecology, the limits of the capacity the network has for linguistic transformation. A transformative mode of criticism is then committed not only to questioning the control actions of hegemonic technologies, but also to finding possible spaces for transformation. Is it possible to reappropriate new technologies not as paranoid instruments aimed at controlling future variability, but as tools capable of caring for environmental transformation? So what you see here is a visual poem that I put together using some of those mistranslations of D'Autremont's asemic piece. The fact that machine mistranslation can find meaningful traces in shapes that would otherwise be considered disorder or illegitimate shows that algorithmic misinterpretation has some potential to contribute to more complex readings and experience of the environment. Something similar occurs in what is called eco-asemics. So it's as well an artistic practice that searches for asemic writing in non-human ecosystems. Now the problem with the definitions of ecosemics is that they tend to be based on an oversimplified division between the natural world and the human world. For instance, you have de Villers-Loan's definition as asemic writing found in asemic suggestive shapes in the natural environment. So instead, I propose that we think ecosemics as any practice that searches for asemic traces in places where they are not meant to be found. And in the case of the visual poem, which uses deep learning technologies to find those places, those of instability, then I would call these deep ecosemics. Deep ecosemics does not deny the problems that are inherent to new technologies. On the contrary, it is meant as a creative gesture that engages in critique. Deep ecosemics is aware that new technologies are completely entangled with the planetary problem of the Anthropocene. The electronic devices that we are increasingly dependent on to do our jobs and stay communicated not only require raw materials that are extracted from the earth by relentless and unsustainable industries, but will also eventually become electronic waste that then will be dumped on the lands of less privileged nations. The reality that our lifestyles are supported by natural resource depletion and contemporary slavery is a deeply traumatic one. As argued by Leroy Medovoy in Sustainability as Disavowal, our concept of sustainability both acknowledges the fact that capitalist relationship with the environment is unsustainable, it's problematic, and at the same time it tries to fix this simply by making it a bit less unsustainable. Therefore, sustainability is both the intended solution to the problem of non-renewable resources and at the same time its very justification. This is how sustainability comes to fulfill a very specific function in capitalism, namely that of disavowal. In psychoanalysis, disavowal is the symptomatic gesture that allows the ego to preserve its own image in the face of a reality that is too extreme to either admit or to fully ignore. Deep ecosemics is a practice that, rather than ignoring its paranoid implications, actually tries to come to terms with its own contradictions. The explorative gesture of discovering incalculable signs in unpredictable places can be understood as a way to start considering what may be preemptively disavowed in our relationship with the environment. In this way, deep ecosemics brings to the surface relations that would otherwise remain hidden in our positionality as tech users in a capitalist environment. Deep ecosemics manages to fold machine translation back onto itself and using the excess that this folding creates in order to forge a more complex environment and interpretation thereof. This is how machine mistranslation can be understood as providing spaces of environmental unknowability that are capable of contesting the control that algorithms otherwise assert in determining an increasingly standardized future. Thank you for your attention, and this is the end. Thanks.